Welcome back to our last part of the series with Sam Hensler and dynamic analysis. I hope you enjoy.
What are other things besides foundation issues that can cause uneven floors?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that can cause it. I'd say probably the second most common issue is going to be undersized beams along bearing lines, and that'll even happen in higher end neighborhoods or in relatively new houses. I still see it in new construction every once in a while where there's a beam that's been installed by the contractor in its original construction and it just is not adequately sized for the load that it's carrying, and just no one caught it because we don't have the strongest enforcement in Montana in general. Usually the city inspectors in town are good about catching that kind of stuff. You're kind of on your own if you're outside the city, but I've definitely seen that in the city limits, undersized beams supporting significant portions of both the floor and the roof, and having a pretty significant belly in the floor and the roof because of that. And because it's obvious for us where the bearing line is, and you can see that the ceiling's dipping and the floor is dipping and the roof's dipping all right there. We can't see the beam, but we know it's too small.
Yeah, fair enough. I like it. All right.
I guess to follow up on that, a less common issue would just be lack of support, which is similar to the undersized beam, but it's really common for people to make modifications on homes, and it's not uncommon for people to do that incorrectly or to not fully understand what it is that they're doing. So they may take out a bearing wall or some posts or change the load pass of the house in a way that is now overwhelming certain structural elements in the house. Those ones are a little bit more difficult for us to put together, but that's one of the things we look at whenever we're doing any structural health check, is to see if there are construction deficiencies that are leading to certain behaviors in the house, or that might lead to certain behaviors in the house. But generally, you're going to have any sort of sagging if there's loss of support or inadequate support. So any posts, an example, someone had a plumber come in and replumb a refrigerator, and they took out a post to put in some plumbing, didn't put the post back in. Homeowner started noticing some floor sloping. I went and took a look, and the house was almost ready to cave in just because a post had been removed and hadn't been put back. And it was a very important post, like it was supporting a significant portion of the house, but that was what was leading to that floor sloping, was this necessary support from that post was just gone.
Yeah, I think I saw one on both the training you gave us, and I saw one in real life where somebody had stuffed fire logs, wedged fire logs into a beam support or a post support, and I shook my head. It's like, wow.
Yeah, you see all kinds of stuff. We've seen coffee cans full of sand as footings. I mean, anything you can think of, we've probably seen as someone's attempt to provide strength to a structure.
Oh, wild. If a home is 100 years old and they're settling, should a homeowner or a potential buyer be concerned?
It's another one where it depends. So in most cases, in almost every case, it's probably not, but there are specific cases that can happen where it is concerning. So number one, if we're looking at an older house, so we look at a significant portion of the houses we look at are around 100 years old or greater than 70 years old. And if we see that sort of settlement, 3-4 inches of settlement, the first thing we're going to look for is evidence of, is it recent? Is there indications that this settlement has happened in the last decade or two? Because if it has, that is concerning. If it happened a long time ago, or if it's just been happening really, really, really slowly over 100 years, that's not nearly as concerning. But because geological processes are so slow, you can have certain instances where a house is stable indefinitely, and then all of a sudden it begins to move because the soil it was built on was never really stable to begin with. But 100 years in terms of soil movement is just nothing. So a specific case, a house in a certain neighborhood we looked at that was built in the early 60s. I looked at it before a homeowner had purchased it, and it had just over an inch of settlement, nothing terribly concerning. It had some negative drainage, which I recommended having fixed. They had called 2 years later. It said there were some new cracks developing. I went out and took a look, and it had moved another 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch or so, which was interesting because, you know, for the first 50 years, it only moved about an inch. But then 2 years, in a small 2-year period, it moved almost double that.
Yeah.
Still hadn't fixed the negative drainage, so it's more important now that we need to address that. Otherwise, we're going to get into a point where we need to underpin the foundation if it moves too much for that specific structure. Got another call 2 years later, hadn't made any improvements to the drainage, and more cracks are starting to show up, more doors are binding, and took a look, and we're now at a little over 3 inches. So it was interesting to see a house that had been built 50 years ago move an inch over that time, have no changes made to it, and then over the course of about 5 years, move a little more than 2 inches. So you never really know. It really depends on the soil.
Yeah.
But that's what we're concerned about. Is there indications that there's ongoing movement, or are there indications that any of the movement that we're seeing happened recently?
Gotcha. Okay. In your own words, what causes settling and other structural issues? So we've talked a lot about this throughout this, but I guess probably more appropriate would be in recap. Mm-hmm. What causes settling and structural issues? Yeah,
so most settlement, unrelated to posts being removed or beams being too small, is going to be related to the subgrades, so everything that's happening below the foundation. And there's lots of things that can go wrong underground. If you're in a really normal part of town that, you know, isn't geologically interesting, it's less likely that you're going to see any significant issues. Not impossible, because there's certain adverse soils that exist all over eastern Montana. One of the reasons that we're so busy here is because we exist on this side of the state, where a lot of the soils that we have here were deposited by water or wind, and they have specific characteristics that make them not advantageous to putting a structure on. If we were to go to the west side of the state, they have their own issues, but they're going to be different than the issues that we see over here. They're going to be more related to, you know, geologic movement due to slopes, you know, maybe really specific sorts of pockets of soils in certain areas, like varved clay and around Kalispell. But most people in western Montana have probably never even heard of underpinning a foundation or a helical pier. It's just way less common there than it is here.
Yeah.
Here we have to deal with silts and clays, and that's among the #1 issues for foundations on this half of the state. Silts and clays have really low capacity. They can have some really interesting like chemistry characteristics that makes them behave much differently than sort of your normal gravelly soil. They can swell, they can shrink, they can collapse, they can have extremely low capacity. They freeze and expand because they hold on to water. So there's all kinds of issues. You know, I think a great example of just the difficulty of trying to build on the soils that we have on this whole side of the state is, you know, a large commercial building a bit north of here that had been built correctly is to code, had really tight clay on all sides of it, but had been the subgrade had been dug down and replaced with a bunch of structural fill, really good, strong soil.
Yeah.
But what ended up happening is it just caught a ton of water, and the water had nowhere to go because the clay around it was so tight that it wouldn't let the water escape anywhere. And so that it ended up creating this sort of a pore pressure, this hydraulic pressure that was lifting the entire building up because it was just built on a slab. And so throughout the year, it was just undulating like it was on a waterbed. Even though it was built to code, it had done everything that could have been done to try and deal with the soil issues. It's just one of the sort of unique issues that we have with dealing with these sorts of soils. So just having those low capacity soils will tend to lead to settlement issues, usually because they're getting saturated all the time. So having poor drainage is probably the #1 indicator of settlement issues. There are certain cases where it's not drainage related, where it's just an issue with that soil specifically, just cannot support a structure that's on it, although that's less common. When we're talking about geologically interesting areas, you can have unstable soils, soils that will tend to slide slough, or you could have landslides that have houses on top of them. Much less common here than it is. That's a more common issue on the west side of the state or in California, where there's a lot of that sort of activity, but it certainly happens all over here in certain places. We have a fun mix of soil. Once you go south of the river, it's all cat litter, it's all bentonite clay, and that will tend to expand to impressive amounts, creating huge pressures. And I've seen a lot of foundations that have done very poorly under that pressure, whether it's lifting up the slab and pushing the guts of the home up from the center, or kind of crushing the foundation walls from each side. If they're not designed and built to deal with those specific issues, then they might struggle in those issues. So there's a lot of issues that are ultimately related to the soil, to drainage that's introducing issues to the soil, or the mechanics of the soil itself.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's a mouthful. That's a lot to understand. I like it. Is there anything else you want to add? That was my last question. So anything else you'd like to add?
I think the overall, especially when we're talking about real estate purchases, like the intent of our services for real estate transactions, the structural health checks, the service we provide that's specific to people who want to buy or sell a house, is just understanding how to interpret them, what they're for. I think there's a tendency for people to be afraid of buying a house that has some sort of structural letter attached with it, because there's maybe a misunderstanding about it. But ultimately, our intent with any of these structural health checks is just to share our knowledge, our information, and provide our insight based off of our experience, our education, and to take what we know about houses and to give it to the buyer, to the seller, so that they can have a well-informed, well-educated decision on whether or not to make one of the larger investment decisions that they'll probably have to make. And just to take it at that, like it may be good, it may be bad. There's not really a good or a bad necessarily. It's just information, and it's for that person. It's information for that person to make an informed decision, and so in that sense, it's all good information. Yeah. Because it helps you make a good decision, a well-informed decision.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Sam. Yep. I really appreciate it. Sam Hensler, Dynamic Analysis. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. All right. Easy day.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you